Hello, I'm Dr. James Gilley, and this is American National Government. In this module, we're going to be looking at the domestic policy-making process for the United States of America, right? The sorts of things we make policy about, and also some considerations about the political economy of our country. So let's go ahead and just dive right into how this policy-making process plays out. So what we've got here is the notion of how a bill or an idea about policy becomes a law. And I would really recommend going ahead and pausing and watching the I'm Just a Bill Schoolhouse Rock video. It actually does a remarkably good job of explaining how this policymaking process goes. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a card in this video right here. Should pop up in a here-ish timing. Go ahead and pause my video and go ahead and watch the link on the card there. It's about 3.5 minutes. You might have remembered watching this video as a kid, but it's still highly relevant to how a bill becomes a law. So go ahead and click pause now, and you should be back. All right. So as your Schoolhouse Rock video showed you, there are really 8 steps, more or less, for some bill becoming a law, right? So what we see is that in order for a law to be created in our country, we first have to have some sort of idea. Now, in the Schoolhouse Rock, right, their idea is that buses should have to stop at railroad crossings, right? That's not a bad idea, right? Someone had to come up with that idea. So they created this bill, they wrote it, and then it was introduced as a potential piece of legislation, right? A bill that could become a law into the House of Representatives. Right? It's introduced into the House. There, the bill is then referred to its committee. Right? So it's given. Right? They're like, okay, this bus stopping bill, that's probably a transportation issue. So we're going to refer that to the Transportation Committee, where they're then going to have a hearing about whether or not this is a good bill. They're going to invite in the public and experts to talk about this issue in the committee, and during the committee process, right, they're going to have the ability to do what they call markup, or change the bill, add things to it, subtract things to it, right, as they see fit. Then they're going to have a discharge vote within the committee. So far, we're still in the committee of the House of Representatives for this bill. If it's voted to be discharged, it then goes on to the main floor to be debated again. Once it's discharged, it can be either given a ticket, right? All bills have to have a ticket in order to be debated. And this ticket says whether it's going to be an open rule bill or a closed rule bill. An open rules bill is going to mean that this bill can be freely debated on the House floor, right? And it can also have amendments added to it along the way, right? Be part of the kind of horse trading or log rolling process we've already talked about this semester. If it's given closed rules, on the other hand, then it just has to have a straight up or down vote the way it is. And what we've seen over the last 30 years or so is that more and more of these bills end up as closed rule bills as opposed to open rule bills. So once it's voted on, right, it's passed in the House, it then goes to the Senate to go through basically the same voting procedure again. Once it then clears the Senate, there's possibility that there's 2 different types of bills out there. And each one needs to be debated, right? And it needs to come together in conference to create one single legal output. And once you get one single bill from the House and the Senate out of conference, it then goes to the president, who has the option to either sign it and that bill becomes a law, or the president can veto it. Boom, use the veto hammer. And it then goes back to the House, where it can be overridden with a 2/3 majority vote. But that's a very rare thing. So if a president vetoes a bill, either by pulling out the veto stamp or just sticking it in his pocket and never signing it, then the bill, right, doesn't become a law. But if a bill becomes a law, right, actually gets that signature or gets pushed through with a 2/3 majority override by Congress, then there's still the possibility that the bill could be enforced in weird ways. So it's possible that a bill or a law could end up back in the court system via that process we talked about in the last module, where it is still reviewed once more for constitutionality and about how it gets employed. So that very simply is how a bill becomes a law. But there's a lot more to this policy making process than just that schoolhouse rock. That's just kind of our introduction to how a bill becomes a law. So let's dig a little bit deeper then. So in order for us to understand the policy making process, we have to understand what it is we're making policy about. And broadly speaking, the domestic policy that gets created falls into one of two camps. It's either going to be economic policy, which deals with the economy in some way, shape, or form, or it's going to be social policy, which even then has a largely economic dimension. So since the economy plays such a large role in our bill making, what we need to do is look at how we view the economy. And even approaches to good capitalism, there are two main views on how capitalism should work. The first of these views is kind of what we think of as the mainstream. This episode is brought to you by Diet Mountain Dew. No, it's not, but I would totally take a sponsorship. So Keynesian economics, or mainstream economics, is what we call a macroeconomic viewpoint. And what does that mean? It means that the economy is viewed as a whole, and that you can actually create models and use statistics to understand the rules of how the economy functions. Under this viewpoint, it's largely seen that the economy is driven via demand. So for a Keynesian economist, the worst thing that can happen in an economy is to have high levels of unemployment. Now, the reason for this, the reason why unemployment is so bad, is because when people are unemployed, they don't have money. And if you don't have money, you can't buy things. And if you can't buy things, the people that make stuff are going to make less of that stuff. Demand will be lower. And when demand goes down and you don't need to make as much stuff, you don't need as many people to make it. So then you lay more people off, and then they can't buy things. So fewer things get made, and so on and so on. And this is almost a death spiral of unemployment, causing massive economic stagnation. So in order to deal with that, it is actually the government's job to intervene in the economy, to pump money into the economy. To pump money into the economy. I guess these afternoon recording sessions give me the yawns. Need more Diet Mountain Dew there. It's the government's job to pump money into the economy so that people have money to buy stuff. So they buy more things, so they make more things, they need more people to make them, and on, and to reverse that spiral. The government has a very important role to play in the economy. They need to intervene, provide stimulus to fight against the animal spirits, the bull market that's rushing forward is typically followed by a bear market where the economy slows down. And under a Keynesian view, that's the natural flow of a business cycle. The economy rises, and then it drops, and it rises, and it drops up and down and up and down. So instead, it's the government's job to step in to keep the economy fairly constantly rising. And in doing this, they do it in three main ways. One, they provide stimulus, direct spending. Even if this causes an increase in a deficit, that's going to be okay under a Keynesian view. They also create a lot of regulations about how people can behave within the economy. And additionally, they provide insurance so that when you take a risky move, increasing risky behavior, you know that you're going to be okay even if this venture fails. So a Keynesian viewpoint, the government, it is its job to intervene in the economy in some fairly substantial sorts of ways. This is kind of the mainstream economics. If you go to an economics department just about anywhere in the country, this is how they're going to be doing economics. It's going to be a lot of computer modeling, a lot of statistics, a lot of formulas and calculations, etc., etc. On the flip side of this, right, the other way of looking at the economy is via the Austrian economic model. This is what we call a microeconomic viewpoint. So what the Austrians view the economy as is the sum total of every interaction within the system. Right? That every single individual action, me going in and purchasing, right, one of these, that's part of the economy. You paying to take this course is part of the economy. The economy isn't a series of animal spirits. It's an aggregation or bringing together of all of the billions of individual interactions within the total of the system. The market is just kind of the aggregated view of all these very individual interactions. So it's really important to understand how individuals think and how these individual actions occur within the system. So for an Austrian, the worst thing you can possibly do is have a high level of inflation within your system. Now, this is different than the Keynesian viewpoint, right? So if the Keynesians are relying on these kind of larger models of how the economy functions, for Austrians, what really matters is individual interactions and individual thoughts. And the reason why inflation would be the worst thing around is that people largely use prices of money, right? The value of things as shown by prices and money to make decisions within the complex world that is the market. So money can stand in for a whole lot of information about the system, and knowing that your money is going to have a very steady value over time, knowing that your money is going to have a very steady value over time allows you to, right, think about how you're going to act over that course of time. So really, it's not a good thing for the government to intervene under an Austrian view, right? Because anytime the government intervenes, right, this skews the knowledge available in the system, right? This skews the individual interactions, causing bubbles that boom and pop. So really what Austrians want is more of a circular flow, a steady state growth where everyone kind of understands interactions within the system. And under an Austrian model, they actually don't want regulation, they don't want stimulus, and they do not want insurance. They want people to behave in much more risk-averse sorts of ways. Right? When you have insurance, you're more likely to be much more risky in the decisions that you make. So by getting rid of insurance as well as regulation and stimulus, this causes people to behave fairly cautiously and in fairly predictable sorts of ways. So the push. I'm so sorry, guys. Right, this push towards deregulation is really about causing a much more steady state of economic growth. Now, where this enters in, where this becomes important for the policy-making process, is that if you view the economy through kind of an Austrian lens, then the government's not going to want to play much of a role in manipulating either the economy or really social life in any sorts of ways. But if you're a Keynesian, then there is a much larger role for the government in, right, pushing forward the economy. And politicians, largely speaking, like to have a role to play. So we're going to see much more heavily things skewed towards Keynesian economics and a Keynesian understanding of the economy when we look at the United States economic policies. Now, this difference between the two types of understandings of the economy becomes really important when you look at particular things like why there was such a large culture of deregulation from the 1980s into the early 2000s. That's because they were trying to switch over to an Austrian style, but they didn't get rid of insurance, which creates major problems for the banking industry and really causes the financial collapse of 2008. So the problem becomes when you start mixing these two, right? They're really things that shouldn't go together. They're like oil and vinegar. You shouldn't mix them. Now, they can be real gratifying if you put them together, right? This could be like the best of both worlds. But ultimately, they do not really truly mix. And they cause a whole lot of instability when they are mixed together, leading to the 2008 financial crisis. But that's a story for another class. So let's move on a little bit. So, largely speaking, when our government goes about making economic policy, it generally falls into two particular economic areas. The first of these areas is what we call fiscal policy. This is when the government steps in to stimulate and grow the economy or try to slow it down. This is when the government attempts to intervene in the business cycle, and this also has a whole lot to do with taxing and spending policy within our country. Monetary policy, on the other hand, is about really manipulating the supply of money and access to credit. And our federal government doesn't really do much of this. This has actually been given over to an independent central bank known as the Federal Reserve. So fiscal policy is done through the Treasury and through Congress. Monetary policy is done through the Federal Reserve. And both of these types of things are meant to manipulate the business cycle, right? The cycle of businesses growing, eventually contracting, right? Almost like breathing, getting bigger, getting smaller. But when this applies to the overall economy, right? When the economy starts to shrink, if too much of the economy shrinks at the same time, you end up with an overall recession where, the overall economy begins to shrink. And that's not a good thing. Now, the ways we go about measuring how well our economy is doing are known as inflation, right? How much our monetary supply grows, and also unemployment, how many people don't have jobs. These are really the two key measures that Congress looks in on, that our government looks in on, in an attempt to govern itself and govern the economy. But they also look at several other things, like consumer price index, which is how much people can buy with their money, their level of income inequality within society, how much wealth overall there is, and the size of the overall economy as measured by gross domestic product, which is really all of the entirety of our economic activity. So the government does a whole lot to manipulate these sorts of economic things. Most of the economic policy really comes in and deals with fiscal policy. That's really what most of the things that our government is doing is about, this fiscal policy. Right? And really at its core, fiscal policy is all about how we pay for our government. So our government is predicated, and all of our fiscal policy is predicated on something called our budget. Right? Our budget is actually originated from the Office of Budget and Management in the president's under the president's purview. So the president's the one who actually writes the budget. And the budget typically consists of about 1/3 of the entire gross domestic product of our country. Now, the president's budget is checked by Congress, right? The Congressional Budget Office plays a role in checking the budgetary process. But something that's interesting is that where the actual money our government seeks to spend comes from. So over here on the left-hand side, we have really where all of our budget comes from. About 1/3 of our entire budget in the United States, about 33%, comes strictly from income taxes, right? The taxes. When you talk about it, right, taxes, right, you immediately just check out. But this is important, right? 1/3 of our entire budget comes from our income taxes. Another 25% comes from payroll taxes. Those are the taxes that get withheld, right, that our businesses have to pay just because they have employees. Another 10%, so that puts us up to right about 60%, right, comes from corporate income tax. 3% comes from excise taxes, which are usage taxes for various sorts of things. Another 3% comes from what we call other sources, which include tariffs. And that gets us to right about 70%. So where the rest of it comes from, strictly speaking, is deficit spending and borrowing, right? We actually have to borrow, right, by the Treasury issues bonds. People buy those bonds, right, which is essentially borrowing money for the future. We do this both domestically and internationally. So about 1/3 of our budget, right, is going straight onto the national credit card. And we're going to have to pay that back in the future. And that's going to create a massive sink, right? Just the interest payments on that are going to create a massive suck on our economic ability to operate in the near future. So the way that we do taxes, right, really kind of falls into two different categories as well. We have this notion of a progressive tax that is paid the more that you make, the more gets taken away from you. That's the income and payroll taxes, as well as corporate income taxes. A regressive tax is where everyone pays the same percentage regardless of income. That's going to be excise taxes, tariffs, and really borrowing. So both of these types of taxes are employed to make up the money that our government uses and spends. So money comes in, money got to go out. So where does this money go to? Over 50% of our spending goes into what's called mandatory or uncontrollable spending. This is money that actually legally has to be spent. Right? It's part of our mandates. It's part of our we are required to spend this money. These are things like Medicare and Social Security. That's half the budget right there. Everything else goes into discretionary spending. That's going to be about half of that, 20% or so of our overall spending is defense spending. And then everything else, right? So about a quarter of our entire budget goes to literally everything else that we do. Right, the way that our spending looks is perhaps radically different than you might think it is. We really don't spend that much on things that aren't Medicare, Social Security, or defense. Those are our primary big budget items there. And the budget process, right, like we already said, the president writes it, passes it on to the Office of Management and Budget. Then the legislature approves that budget, right, and that's where they tinker with it in the discretionary spending portion, lets their priorities be known. And the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, oversees the entire fiscal policy process. We also have a large role of our government being played in monetary policy and economic regulation. Right? When we talk about monetary policy, this is about how much money is available in the system and how, quote, liquid it is, how easily this money can flow. And like I'd already mentioned, the U.S. government really passed on its ability to do policy making to a private entity known as the Federal Reserve Board. The executive branch actually gets to appoint the leaders of the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Senate approves them. Right? And they serve 14 years terms. So the government sets up the leadership of this private bank, but it operates independent of our government. Now, what the Federal Reserve does is it sets what's known as the prime interest rate, or how much money the banks out there have to pay in order to borrow money or get money from the Federal Reserve, right? It's the Federal Reserve that actually prints our money. So the Federal Reserve gets to set how much everyone else can borrow it for. Now, over the course of the last decade or so, in response to the housing crisis, interest rates have been slashed to essentially zero. Right, the zero interest rate policy, or ZIRP, as you see over there, has really suppressed interest rates. And what we've seen is that every time the Federal Reserve has tried to ratchet it up back to normal interest rates, which are considered to be above 3%, this caused a little dip in the stock market. So it's made the Federal Reserve really wary to raise interest rates in the last decade, which really skews a lot of the tools that we have to regulate the business cycle in this country. And again, if you want to know more about this political economics, that's going to be for you. So this will be, again, a discussion for another class. But the last thing I want to talk about on the economic policy side, right, the kinds of policies that are being made, are economic regulations right above me. And right, the government has a large ability. Congress has a very large ability to regulate the economy. Right, the Interstate Commerce Clause gives a lot of ability for the government and Congress to regulate our economy. So what they have and what they're capable of doing here, they really have a large set of tools available to them. The biggest tool that they have is the ability to support industries via what are known as subsidies, or actual cash giveaways to certain industries. A really good example of this is the sugar industry, right? We're down here in South Louisiana. Our federal government gives a lot of subsidy to sugar industry to either grow or not grow sugar, right? It's a very protected industry. The government also gives a whole lot of money to really a lot of industries, right? Solar power, automotive, right? Anytime you've got like a government rebate or an incentive program, that's a subsidy that's going straight to industry. The aerospace industry is very heavily subsidized as well. Additionally, right, when a business, right, not just trying to help a business get going, which is what subsidies can be good for, but also trying to help a business recover from a very tough period, or if it's failing, the government can provide what are called bailouts. We saw this in the housing market, the financial markets, and automotive markets in 2008 and 2009. When these industries began to fail, the government actually stepped in, gave them a bunch of money, helped them get back up on their feet. In large part, the government has the ability to manipulate trade policy and put into place tariffs to protect industries, right? To essentially put a tax on importation that gets passed along to each and every one of us, right? Tariffs, generally speaking, aren't a great idea. I'm not gonna get on the soapbox right now, but I will get on the soapbox by the end of this lecture about tariffs. Generally speaking, tariffs are not a good idea. Trade wars are not fun and easy to win. Trade wars are very tough. They're very unprofitable. Generally speaking, people are better off when we are trading in a very free sorts of ways with other countries. So it allows for specialization and all that. But we'll get back to that. Another thing that's interesting to talk about are trade deficits, right? We hear a lot of talk about how we're importing more than we export, and then that's supposedly us losing in the economy, but that's really not how the modern global economy functions. The modern global economy is about specializing in certain things. So, right, we may not be selling stuff. We sell ideas. We sell education. We sell services. And the things that we do make, like our cell phones here, right? These cell phones, right? These cell phones really are complex pieces of technology, right? They're designed in the United States. It says that right down here on the bottom. Designed in the United States, designed in California, typically California. Then those designs go to China, where components are made, and then they're shipped back to be assembled somewhere else. And then they're shipped to Mexico to be packaged, and they're shipped back to the U.S. So where does that item come from? Right? Each time there's a flow of something across borders, that gets calculated into trade deficits. But that's really not the overall picture here, right? And when those items go out to be sold, right, they're not just sold in the United States, they're sold elsewhere. And the profits from those do go to American corporations. So trade deficit really isn't what what it simplistically seems to be. So that creates some problems there. The government has the ability to regulate monopolies. It can break up monopolies if it sees that there is anti-competitive activity occurring in the system. So that's really important. We haven't seen as much regulation of monopoly and antitrust activity since really there was some in the 1980s, right? The last big thing to be broken up was telephone industry. Before that, right, really antitrust power was most heavily used kind of in the 19-teens and 20s. Teddy Roosevelt was a big trust buster and the like there. Government can set rules about how we can use labor. They set wage rates and whether or not we can, what age you're allowed to work at. They also are able to set up health and safety regulations, right? OSHA is a big organization that does that. In this country, we have a right to assembly, which means we have a right to unionize. And so the government's able to help, right, labor relations along like that. And the government regulates usages of the stock market, right? The Security and Exchanges Commission says what's legal and what isn't legal to do vis-a-vis the stock market. No insider trading, no pump and dump scams, things like that. In large part, the government, via economic policy, is able to regulate the economy, not just the economy, but the environment. Oddly enough, the Clean Air, Clean Water Acts and the EPA were created by a Republican president. This used to be a Republican thing, right? Richard Nixon about the last guy you would expect is the person who got all of those things started. The government also plays a huge role in regulating transportation and banking. Right? The government really has a large ability to step into any sort of industry that could potentially be interstate, right, between state lines. So the government plays a big role in economic regulations as well as fiscal and monetary policy. But that's not all. There's also direct social policy that our government does. Now, the largest portion of our social policy comes into play via what are called social safety nets, or means-tested entitlements. Right? These are things that our government gives to people in an attempt to help them if they fall off of the tightrope that is our economy. Right? It's a net meant to catch people that fall off right the edges of the economy. And a means-tested entitlement only goes to people who are able to prove that they lack the means or that they meet certain requirements. Some good examples of means-tested entitlement: Social Security, where you either have to have a disability or be of a certain age. Our Medicare, Medicaid, again, are either financial or age-based entitlements. Public housing, food assistance. Most of our social policy is brought through these means-tested entitlements. But there are also other entitlements that are considered to be citizen entitlements that you're given just because you're a citizen. A good example of that would be access to public education, or in certain states, right, you actually receive what's called a citizen's dividend, right? You actually get paid just because you're a citizen of that state. It's Alaska. If you live in Alaska, you're an Alaskan citizen and you live there most of the year, you actually get paid to do that because of oil and natural gas in that state. But that would be a citizen entitlement as opposed to a means-tested entitlement. So we in America, we do a lot of public assistance sort of things, and we create social insurance programs in order to help people out. We also have rules about how healthcare gets implemented that really have changed over time to do a lot of different things to achieve different social sorts of outcomes. And over the last 100 years or so, we've seen three major kind of waves of changes in our social policies. The first big wave of this occurred under FDR. It's called the New Deal or the Square Deal. And this is when we introduced a lot of things to help the poor and kickstart our economy during a time of major trouble. But this introduced Social Security, both for the disabled and the old. It introduced a lot of unemployment welfare assistance. It was really meant to help the disabled, the poor, and the elderly. Was this original New Deal under FDR. About 30 years later, LBJ comes through with this idea of the Great Society and waging a war on poverty. And what this is meant to do is to really help those on the bottom rungs of society, right, take leaps forward. This created food stamps, which eventually became the SNAP program, the Senate Nutritional Assistance Program. Created Head Start to get early child care and education involved. Created both Medicare and Medicaid to help in that provision of health care when employer-based health care just couldn't apply. Greatly expanded housing assistance in the 1960s and into the 1970s as well. And then about 30 years after that, we saw a massive revision of healthcare provision, bringing in Obamacare under President Obama. So what we largely see is that there's a lot of economic influence with our social policy, but there are some things that are just applied kind of widely within the population, Education and social policies like Food and Drug Administration, what we can put into our bodies, those sorts of things also are heavily, who you can marry, our general social policies, the things that aren't, the nexus of economics and social policy really are important. as well, but these are typically enacted via some sort of federalist thing, right? The federal government might set some guidelines, but largely the states get to put it into practice however they see fit. So we make a whole lot of policy in this country. Most of it has to do with the economy, but large swaths of it have to do with our social decisions as well, right? Kind of intending to nudge people in the direction we want to go, right? We're not really a nation of saying what you can and can't do socially, but we do try to nudge people into making better decisions, right? And we do this through economic incentives. So that's why we see kind of a lot of meshing of these social and economic policies. So, right, that's kind of the main overview. I've got one, right, I want to spend just a couple of seconds on some soapbox stuff just because it's important. So I want to wrap up with this. This is kind of my parting thought, right? As you can see, I got a little riled up when we talked about tariffs. And I'm going to let myself do that for about 5 minutes here. Well, way less than 5 minutes, but we're going to do it here. So what I would recommend, right, just read this and you could probably check out. Right. But largely speaking, tariffs not only impose immense economic costs, but also fail to achieve their primary policy aims and foster political dysfunction along the way. Tariffs don't really do what we want them to do, right? It would seem to make a whole lot of sense intuitively that if you put a tariff up, right, that's going to, right, make things from elsewhere, imports more expensive. That's going to help out the economy internally. But largely speaking, what we see is that the way that our globalized and integrated economy works is that if we try to break up that system, right, put up walls against trade, it doesn't have the intended policy aim, right? We wanted to, here's a good example, right? In the early days of the Trump administration, he put into place a tariff on washers and dryers. This is meant to allow American washer and dryer companies to be able to better compete with their things, right? That their prices would be more on par with everyone else's prices. But what we saw is that because it was also tied to a steel tariff, right? We don't really make much steel in this country anymore. So in importing the steel that was necessary to make those washers and dryers, this caused their own prices to go up, as well as the prices of imported washers and dryers to go up. So Americans ended up paying a whole lot more for washers and dryers, to the tune of about $1.2 billion in the overall economy, whereas the tariff brought in about $86 million worth of revenue. So the government wasn't able to raise money, prices went up for average consumers, and it didn't really protect the washer and dryer manufacturers industry because they still had to import steel to do what they wanted to. And it caused, right, the entire political system to go crazy. So tariffs don't really work. Tariff policy is bad policy. Trade wars are not easy to win. Shouldn't enter into them anyway, right? And as we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next module, when people are trading together, they're less likely to enter into conflict. And that's probably what we should be aiming for. I usually try to not take too many big political stances in teaching this class, teaching it more from an institutional perspective. But when it comes to policy, right, tariffs are just, they're real stupid. Don't do them. Trading with other people is a good thing. All right, the more integrated we are, the better things end up working out. So that's really going to do it for now. We only have one module left. We're going to talk about foreign policy in our next module. That's going to be should be a pretty fun discussion. So I'm going to say thank you and good afternoon, good evening, good night, whatever time it happens to be for you. And I'll see you in our last module. Thank you.